Your competitor may not build a better product than you. They may not have a more modern factory. Their teams may not be more talented. And yet, within a few years, they could be launching more products, responding much faster to market changes, and scaling their business while you are still spending a significant portion of your energy managing orders, inventory, and administrative tasks. Because today, a gap is beginning to emerge. And this gap doesn't separate large companies from small ones, or wealthy companies from less wealthy ones. It separates two different ways of running a business. On one side, are organizations that still rely on the same mechanism they used 20 years ago. Countless email, information everywhere, endless approval, and teams that spend a significant part of their time coordinating, verifying, and moving information around. On the other side is a new generation of industrial companies that aren't only innovating on their product, but also the way they operate every day. Companies that reject the idea that every stage of growth must inevitably come with more complexity, more coordination, and more administrative work. Instead of continuously adding new layers on an existing system, they're rebuilding an entire different way of operating. And while many companies are still trying to optimize yesterday methods, these businesses are already experimenting with the one that will define the next decade. What makes this particularly interesting is that this isn't a futuristic scenario. For months, we've been speaking with manufacturers, brands, and industrial companies that produce physical goods. And every time, we come away with the same impression, as if two different eras were still coexisting within the same industry. One is focused on managing complexity more effectively. The other is trying to eliminate it altogether. And that's exactly why this gap could become one of the greatest competitive advantages of the years ahead. When you speak with companies that are currently pulling ahead, one thing becomes clear very quickly. Their difference isn't only about what they produce. It's also about how they operate on a day-to-day. For a long time, industrial innovation focused on the product. A better formula, a better material, redesigned packaging, an optimized manufacturing process. Of course, these things still matter. But another innovation is now becoming increasingly important, the ones that concern operation. This company no longer see operation as a single cost center or an administrative layer required to keep the business running. They see them as a core performance lever. And this shift creates significant gaps. They bring new products to market more easily, they adapt faster when conditions change, and they make better decisions because they have greater visibility. And above all, they spend far less energy managing their own complexity. Because in many organizations, a large part of the day is still absorbed by tasks that create no direct value. Searching for information, checking whether a piece of data is correct, updating multiple tools, tracking an order, fixing an error, moving information from one team to another. These activities have become so routine that no one even notices them anymore. They are part of the background, but the most advanced companies are starting to look at them differently. They no longer ask how to manage them efficiently, they ask how to make them disappear. And that's probably where most of the important gaps in the industry are going to happen. Because while some teams are still spending a large part of their time coordinating work, others are building systems that can take over part of that effort. And that makes this evolution so interesting because this isn't the first time economic history has followed this trajectory. To understand what's happening today, we need to take a step back. This history isn't new. Industry has already gone through several transformations of this scale. Let's go back to the beginning of the 20th century. Before electricity, factories depended almost entirely on human effort. Machines were limited, production moved slowly, and growth was constrained by that reality. Then, electricity began to spread. As with every major disruption, some companies immediately saw the potential. Others believed that their existing methods were already good enough. Why disrupt an organization that's already working? Why invest so much for uncertain benefits? And yet, a few years later, the outcome was undeniable. Companies that adapt the new technology produce more, faster, and at a lower cost. The gap had already started to widen. The arrival of computing created the same pattern. Paper was gradually replaced by computers. Some organizations embraced it from the start, while others kept operating as before. Then came the internet. Once again, many saw it as just another tool. Others understood it would fundamentally change the way businesses operate, communicate, and grow. Every time, the pattern has been the same. A new technology emerged. At first, it seems optional. Then, it becomes inevitable. ERPs follow exactly the same trajectory. For the first time, companies could bring together sales, procurement, inventory, production, and logistics in the same system. It wasn't just a new tool, it was a new way of structuring the company. And that's exactly what's happening again today, with one key difference. Previous technological shift helped companies collect information, structure it, and share it. The current shift goes further. For the first time, systems don't record what's happening. They start participating in what should happen next. That's why a new generation of companies is emerging. Companies that aren't only focused focus on improving products or processes. They are redesigning how operations themselves work, and that's where the next major industrial transformation begins. For a long time, industrial growth followed an almost mechanical rules. When activity increased, companies added resources. More customers, they expand teams. More orders, they hired. More suppliers to manage, they hired again. And when new products or new market came along, the response stayed largely the same. Add more people to absorb the workload. For years, this model worked extremely well. But as companies grow, something starts to change. The challenge is no longer just about producing more or selling more. The challenge becomes managing the complexity that comes with growth. Every new customer brings its own requirements. Every new supplier adds interaction to track. Every new product introduces new rules, new constraints, and new exception. And without really noticing it, companies gradually accumulate layers everywhere. A new spreadsheet to track a specific topic, another one, an additional software tool, a procedure created to secure a process, a validation step added to avoid mistakes, a meeting to better coordinate teams. Individually, each decision makes sense. Sometimes it's even necessary. But years after years, the overall system becomes increasingly difficult to manage. This is often when leaders start to feel a kind of frustration that's hard to explain. The company keeps growing, teams are busy, days are full, and yet everything feels slower than before. Finding information has become difficult, an order passes through multiple hands before being processed, a stock error triggers a chain of checks, and a simple scheduling adjustment requires several exchanges. Decisions that should take a day sometimes takes several weeks. Little by little, a growing share of the company's energy is no longer dedicated to creating value. It gets absorbed by managing its own complexity. And here is the thing. Companies hire to support growth, but that growth generates even more control, more coordination, more validation, and more administrative work. At a certain point, a company of 50 people can start experiencing the same friction as a company 10 times its size. Not because it's become huge, but because a significant portion of its resources is now focused on moving information rather than moving the business forward. The symptoms are often the same. Inventory becomes harder to manage, teams spend more and more time syncing up. Information takes longer to circulate. Mistakes become more costly. Delays increase. Decisions take longer than they should. And above all, a feeling that starts to settle in. Everyone is working extremely hard, but no one really feels like the company is moving at the same speed. This is exactly the idea that a new generation of companies is beginning to challenge. Because they are asking a simple question. What if a large part of this complexity wasn't an inevitable consequence of growth? What if it was mainly the symptom of a way of operating that's no longer suited for today's companies? Now, let's look at the companies that are starting to pull ahead. When you speak with them, one difference quickly becomes clear. They no longer see the business in the same way. For a long time, competitive advantage was mainly built on the product, but the companies emerging today have understood that competition also happens elsewhere, in how they execute. This means their ability to adapt when the market shifts, to launch new offerings without slowing down the rest of the organization, to solve a problem before it turns into a crisis, to scale without letting complexity invade every part of the organization. This is where a new generation of industrial players is emerging. Companies that treat operation as a strategic asset. Just like their brand, their know-how, or their technology. They keep innovating on their products, but they also innovate on how the company operates day to day, on how information are flowing end to end, on how decisions are made, on how operations are executed. This shift is far from trivial because they've started questioning things that mainly still considered normal. Why should a single order be entered mid-time? Why should an entire team spend its day moving information from one module to another? Why should someone open multiple pages just to understand a simple situation? For a long time, these frictions were accepted as a price of doing business. Today, some companies see them differently, not as inevitable constraint, but as a flaw in how the system was designed. And this is exactly what explains the gap that's starting to widen. While many companies are still using technology to store more information, these organizations are focused on reducing the invisible work that slows their team down. And when they succeed, something interesting happens. Days are less consumed by checking, following, or searching for information. Teams get back time to what actually moves the business forward, developing new products, better serving customers, exploring new markets, creating new opportunities. That's where the real shift is happening today, between companies that learn to manage ever-growing complexity and those that start to free themselves from it. Let's take a very simple example, a customer order. A recurring event that happens every day, sometimes dozens of times, sometimes hundreds. Yet, behind these simple orders, there is often a significant amount of work that no one really notices. In many companies, it all starts with an email. Someone opens the email, reads the document, checks the product references, verifies the price, makes sure the information matches the customer records, creates the order in the ERP, check whether inventory is available, inform production if necessary, contact a supplier when the product is missing, and so on and so on. This way of working has become so normal that no one questions it anymore. But when you step back, you realize that most of this effort isn't about producing more, serving the customer better, or improving the product. It's mainly about moving information from one step to the next. The data already exists, but it constantly needs to be rechecked, re-entered, reconciled, or forward to the right person. And that's exactly where some companies are starting to operate differently. When an order arrives, a large part of this work cannot be handled immediately. The system recognizes the incoming information, matches it with existing company data, check availability, and alerts the right team when action is needed. If everything is consistent, the process moves forward. If there is an ambiguity or hesitation, it gets flagged to the right person. The role of the team change completely. They no longer spend their time pushing the file forward, they step in when they need to arbitrate, solve a problem, negotiate with the supplier. In other words, where the expertise actually matters. And even more now, the gaps start to widen because by gradually reducing this invisible work, a company doesn't just save hours. It becomes more responsive, more reliable, more predictable. And when this logic extends across orders, procurement, inventory, planning, and logistics, the effect compounds quickly. It's no longer just a few minutes saved here and there. It can be hundreds of hours recorded every month. Time that can finally be reinvested into growing the business, improving customer experience, or preparing the next stage of growth. And this is the moment when some companies start to gain an advantage that others will struggle to close. The most interesting thing about this evolution is that it doesn't necessarily come from the largest groups. We often assume the companies pulling ahead are the ones with the most resources, the most modern factory, or the biggest budgets. On the ground, the reality is often more nuanced. The ones moving the fastest are sometimes simply the ones looking at their operation with fresh eyes. They haven't inherited decades of procedures, task tools, or habits that have become impossible to question. They are starting almost from scratch, and that changes the way they build their organization in a profound way because they still dare to ask questions that many have stopped asking long ago. Why should the same information be entered multiple times? Why should someone switch between tools and modules to complete a simple task? Why should so much time be spent verifying data that already exists somewhere in the company? And above all, why should growth systematically come with an extra layer of complexity? For this company, these aren't unavailable constraints. They are signals that other way of operating is possible. So they design their operation differently. They look for systems that adapt to their activity, rather than forcing their teams to constantly work around the limitation of their tools. They prioritize solutions that take over part of their work, instead of simply recording it. And behind this approach is a simple conviction. Teams build more value when they build the system than when they spend their time feeding the system. After all, no company was created to manage files, move information between software tools, or multiply coordination meetings. A company exists to create something useful, to develop products and to serve customers, to find new opportunities and to grow. That's why a clear divide is starting to appear across many industries. On one side, organizations that still dedicate a large share of their energy to managing the complexity they've accumulated over time. On the other, companies that are actively trying to reduce it at the source. At first, the difference is almost invisible. Then, year after year, the gap expands. One because easier as it grows, the other becomes more fluid, and in the long run, this produces the hardest advantage to replicate. The ability to execute faster, adapt faster, and move forward. Because in the end, markets rarely reward those who work the most. They often reward those who move with the least friction. I think much of the current debate is still focused on the wrong subject. We often talk about AI as if it were just another technology, but what's happening today is likely much deeper than that. Since the beginning of this video, we've talked about orders, inventory, production, supplier, and logistics. But the real project was never the technology itself. The subject is a company ability to turn intent into results, an order into a delivery, an idea into a product, an opportunity into growth. For decades, this transformation relied on massive amount of human collaboration, with constant exchange, approval, check, re-entry of data. Teams were forced to move information between systems that struggle to talk to each other. That's how companies have operated for years. Today, something is starting to change. Systems are no longer just storing data or displaying information. They are gradually participating in the execution of operations themselves. They pass the right information at the right time, trigger certain action, support execution, and take over part of the work that previously relied on teams. This opens the door on a new way of scaling a business, a way where growth doesn't automatically mean more complexity, where teams spend less energy coordinating, verifying, or searching for information, and more energy building, solving, creating, and moving the business forward. Like every major industrial transformation before it, this one won't happen overnight, but it's already in motion. And as always, some company will move ahead of others, not because they have more resources or because they necessarily build better products. It's because they will have found a more fluid way to operate, a more efficient way to turn decision into action, to adapt when conditions change, to learn from what works and to evolve their organization without continuously adding more complexity. At first, this advantage is almost invisible. Then it compounds, day after day, week after week, years after years, until it creates a gap that becomes extremely difficult to close. Because in the end, the companies that win aren't always the ones that work the most. They are often the ones that turn intention into results the faster. The history of industry has already gone through several turning points like this. Electricity, computing, internet, and the cloud. Each time, the same pattern repeated itself. Some companies saw it as a new tool to add on the way they're already working. Others understood that the real shift wasn't the technology itself, it was what allowed them to rethink the way their organization worked. And it's usually those companies that pull ahead. Today, we feel like we're watching a similar transition. A new generation of industrial companies is emerging. Companies that keep innovating on their product, of course, but that pay equal attention to how they operate, how decisions are made, how operations are executed, and how the company moves forward on a daily basis. Because tomorrow leaders won't necessarily be the ones with the best product. They will often be the ones who execute more fluidly, adapt faster, and turn their idea into results more efficiently than everyone else. And that's exactly what we are building at Piston. An agentic ERP designed so that your operations stop being a source of friction and start becoming a true competitive advantage. And ultimately, the question isn't whether this evolution will happen. The real question is what happens when your competitor have already made the shift. At that moment, where will you be?